Good evening. I'm Kathryn Smith, General Director of Madison Opera. Thank you for joining me for a preview of our upcoming production of Rossini's The Barber of Seville. I'll start by talking about Rossini's life and career and then focus on Barber itself. When I'm done with my presentation, we'll go to your questions. If you are watching on October 10th, please type your questions into the YouTube conversation box. If you type them while I'm talking, I will see them when I get to the presentation. If you're watching this after October 10th and want to ask me questions, feel free to email me at info@madisonopera.org. Now I will ask the magic people to share my screen. Gioacchino Antonio Rossini was born in Pesaro, Italy on February 29, 1792. His father was a horn player and slaughterhouse inspector. His mother was a singer. They started their son's musical training early, and by age 6, he played triangle in his father's band. Rossini's father was sympathetic to the French, welcoming Napoleon's troops when they arrived in northern Italy in 1796. When Austria restored the old regime in 1799, Rossini's father was sent to prison. His mother moved to Bologna, making a living as a leading singer at various theaters. When her husband was released from prison, he played the horn in the orchestra pit. Rossini was apprenticed to a blacksmith while at the same time studying piano and voice. At age 12, he wrote 6 string sonatas. At age 13, he made his debut and farewell as an opera singer. He also composed his first opera, although it was not staged until he was 20. As a teenager, he studied at the Bologna Conservatory, where he was known for his devotion to Mozart. Later in life, he said, "Beethoven I take twice a week, Haydn 4 times, and Mozart every day." For timeline's sake, Mozart died when Rossini was 2 years old. Rossini also picked up gigs as a rehearsal pianist for local theaters, practical training that would prove useful. His first opera, The Marriage Contract, premiered in 1810 at the Teatro San Moise in Venice. A comedy of young lovers outwitting her father, it is still performed today, and Rossini was 18 years old. The Teatro San Moise was basically Rossini's graduate school. It was a small company with a small budget, no chorus, and minimal scenery and costumes. Most of the operas had a cast of 6 singers and were 80 minutes long, so Rossini developed a style to match. His second opera, The Curious Misunderstanding, touched on the politically charged subject of army desertion, so it got closed down by the police after the 3rd performance. The same year, Rossini landed in jail after he got into a fistfight with choristers during rehearsal. At age 20, he premiered 6 operas in 11 months in 4 different theaters. One of these, Cyrus in Babylon, was written because only biblical operas could legally be performed during Lent. And note 2 premieres in the month of May, one in Venice and one in Rome, 9 days later and 300 miles away. His most important work that year was La Pietra del Paragone at La Scala in Milan. His first successful full-length opera, it was performed a record 53 times in its first season. More importantly, its success gained him an exemption from military service. Napoleon's viceroy in Milan wrote, "We are perhaps losing a mediocre soldier, but we are surely saving a man of genius for the nation." Throughout his career, the rapidity with which Rossini composed was remarkable. Part of this was a waste not, want not attitude toward composing. He reused his own music all the time. Some music would appear in 3 different operas. He wrote with a degree of speed and facility that has never been equaled, once saying, "Give me a laundry list and I will set it to music." A story. Rossini is composing in bed to stay warm in winter. The paper he's writing on falls onto the floor out of reach. Rather than get out of bed, Rossini starts over with a new piece of paper and writes a totally different number. A friend visits and Rossini shows him both versions. The friend says, "Nothing easier, surely, than to have picked up the first one." Rossini replies, "Nothing easier than to write a new one." He premiered 4 operas in 1813. One of these, Tancredi, was his first serious opera and a huge hit. Tancredi also showed Rossini's practical side. His audience did not want sad endings, so he didn't write them. Even his serious operas tend to end with the good guys winning. In 1815, he got a great gig. The Teatro San Carlo in Naples, the wealthiest opera company in Europe, hired him as musical director. For a quite nice salary, plus a take from the lobby gambling tables, he would compose an opera per year and oversee other composers' works. The San Carlo had several extremely talented singers on contract, so the pieces Rossini wrote for them would be magnificently performed. He was now 23 years old. A quick digression to meet the head of the San Carlo. Domenico Barbea made his first fortune by inventing the cappuccino. He made his second fortune as an arms dealer, and then started running the casino connected to La Scala in Milan. He was made head of the Teatro San Carlo at age 32 and gradually added more theaters to his portfolio, including 2 in Vienna. Among the composers he commissioned were Rossini, Donizetti, Bellini, and von Weber. Rossini's first opera for the San Carlo was Elizabeth, Queen of England. A few months later, he wrote arguably his greatest opera, The Barber of Seville, which we will come back to. His rapid pace continued, with 2 more premieres in 1816 and 4 in 1817. Time for a pet photo. I like to scatter pet photos into my talks on the theory that everyone's life is improved by looking at photos of cute animals. The ones I'll show tonight reside with some of our Barber of Seville company members. So first meet Lily and Jax, who live with stage manager Alyssa Pond Franklin. By age 25, Rossini was the most popular opera composer in Italy. So let's talk about why. His music is called bel canto, literally beautiful singing, characterized by vocal virtuosity with lots of runs and embellishments. It is in general cheerful music, even when the story is serious, or as a character in one of Thomas Pynchon's novels says, the point is a person feels good listening to Rossini. All you feel like listening to Beethoven is going out and invading Poland. Rossini wrote that his motto for music was simple melody and variety in rhythm, and that is one explanation of his success. He wrote tunes. He also wrote dazzling ensembles. His works have amazing quartets, quintets, and septets, and his finales are famous for building to a blazing finish. Rossini was a practical composer. One scholar says of his early years, after arriving in a new town, he first got to know the townspeople and their likes and dislikes. Then he assessed the kinds and types of local singers and musicians. Perhaps, for example, he found a surplus of mezzo-sopranos, an ample supply of woodwinds, and a scarcity of strings. Now it was time to start composing. In other words, he wrote his operas for their audiences, not as isolated works of art. As to the plots, Rossini did not invent anything. Most of his operas have somewhat stock characters. Later in life, he said, I hardly ever got to choose the librettos, which were imposed on me by the impresarios. I would receive only part of the scenario, an act at a time, for which I had to write the music without knowing either how the plot continued or how it was going to end. But he had more depth than his critics said, and his comedies have some very true moments. He was an excellent orchestral writer. One of his signatures became a storm sequence about 2/3 of the way through the opera. He once said, how wonderful opera would be if there were no singers. His overtures are delightful, and many have outlasted their operas. Late in life, Rossini described the correct time to write an opera's overture. Wait until the evening before opening night. Nothing primes inspiration more than necessity, whether it be the presence of a copyist waiting for your work or the prodding of an impresario tearing his hair. In my time, all the impresarios in Italy were bald at 30. His pace of writing continued, with hits like Eduardo and Cristina mixed in with the occasional flop, like Hermione. The early 1820s were ones of transition. An 1820 insurrection against the Naples monarchy spread across Italy, and theaters were closed for much of the year. The company of the Teatro San Carlo traveled to Vienna in 1822. Rossini went with them. En route, he married the company's leading mezzo, Isabella Colbran. She was 37 years old and had sung the leads in several of his operas. Rossini was now 30 years old and had written 32 operas. Rossini was widely celebrated in Vienna. In 3 months, the company performed 6 of his operas, to audiences so enthusiastic that one observer described it as an idolatrous orgy. While in Vienna, Rossini met Beethoven, near the end of his life, but with his Ninth Symphony still ahead. Beethoven told Rossini that he should do more Barbieres and not worry about writing serious opera. Rossini returned to Italy and wrote Semiramide, in which the title character murders her husband, then falls in love with her own son. Colbran starred in the premiere at La Fenice, but her voice was in decline, and it ended her career in Italy. In late fall 1823, Rossini and Colbran headed to England, stopping off first in Paris, where they were warmly received. Then on to London, where they had a lucrative contract for a 5-month season at the King's Theatre. Rossini met King George IV, who was a big fan, and they were paid around £30,000 for the gig. Rossini was supposed to write a new opera in London, but the theatre management went bankrupt before it was completed. He did compose the cantata The Weeping of the Muses on the death of Lord Byron, the poet Byron having died a couple months earlier. The premiere featured Rossini himself, evidently a decent tenor, as Apollo. In general, England was not a good fit for Rossini, as he didn't like the weather or the food. While there, he signed a contract at the French embassy for an official job in Paris to begin in fall 1824. This contract specified that he would write 2 operas, a grand opera for the Paris Opera and an opera buffa for the Théâtre Italien, while also serving as the music director of the latter. King Louis XVIII died soon after Rossini arrived in Paris, so his first work was Il Viaggio a Rême, written in honor of the coronation of Charles X. Rossini's final opera in Italian, it has nothing even resembling a plot, serving instead as a showcase for 14 leading singers. Over the next few years, Rossini wrote several operas to French libretti. All were reworkings of earlier Italian operas. Still only in his 30s, Rossini quickly learned the French style of opera, making the chorus more important and adding ballet. His final opera was William Tell in 1829. A political epic about the Swiss patriot, it was a grand opera in all the senses. Enormous chorus, dance sequences, big orchestra. Wagner and Berlioz were big fans of the piece, and Donizetti wrote, Rossini wrote the first and last acts of William Tell. God wrote the second. William Tell is also over 4 hours long, so it is seldom performed. The overture, however, is one of the most famous things Rossini ever wrote, thanks to the Lone Ranger. And this is Knox, who lives with tenor David Walton, who is singing the role of Count Almaviva with us. William Tell turned out to be Rossini's last opera. He was 37 years old and had composed 39 operas in 19 years. That fall, he returned to Bologna to see his newly widowed father. He had planned to return to Paris, but then the July Revolution of 1830 happened. Charles X fled into exile, and citizen King Louis Philippe nullified all kinds of government contracts, including the one granting Rossini a lifetime pension. Rossini spent several years in litigation in France. Once he won back his pension, he returned to Italy, where his next couple of decades were spent dealing with health issues. The nature of these is unclear, although he had suffered from gonorrhea as early as age 15, and he also had emphysema and bouts of debilitating depression. He was briefly back in Paris in the mid-1840s for medical treatment, inspiring rumors he would write a new opera, but he did not. Rossini had separated from Isabella Colbran in the mid-1830s, and she died in 1845. He then married Olympe Pelletier, a famous artist model that he had been involved with for some time. Political events in 1848 led the two of them to move to Florence for several years. His health continued to deteriorate. In 1854, the 62-year-old Rossini wrote to a friend, "Of a most obstinate nervous malady that robs me of my sleep, and I might say almost renders my life useless." The couple moved back to France the next year in search of better medical care for Rossini. Once there, his health and his spirits revived. He kept homes in both Paris and the country and hosted a weekly salon, serving as the eminence grise of opera composers. He was not shy in his opinions, for example, saying of Wagner, "One cannot judge Lohengrin after a first hearing, and I certainly don't intend to hear it a second time." Rossini was for the most part friendly to younger composers. Among those attending his salons were Gounod, Liszt, Meyerbeer, Verdi, and the English Arthur Sullivan. A story. One morning when Sullivan visited Rossini, the latter was hard at work on a new piece of music. When Sullivan asked what he was writing, Rossini answered, "It's my dog's birthday, and I write a little piece for him every year." Rossini was a well-known gourmet and an excellent chef his entire life, saying, "I know of no more admirable occupation than eating." There are a number of dishes named Rossini that were either created by or for him, and by definition, they include foie gras and truffles. Back to his final years. The public wondered if Rossini would ever write another opera, and rumors occasionally circulated that he would. But he said, "Notes are like women. When they come looking for you, well and good. When you start looking for them, it's time to quit." But while he never wrote another opera, he composed what he called his sins of old age, more than 150 small pieces, including songs and chamber works. For his 70th birthday, some of his friends decided to have a statue built in his honor. He said, "Why not give the money to me, and I'll stand on the pedestal myself." At age 72, he published his Petite Messe Solennelle, Solemn Little Mass, and wrote in the dedication, "Dear God, here it is finished, this poor little mass. Is this sacred music which I have written, or music of the devil? I was born for opera buffa, as you well know. A little science, a little heart, that's all. Be blessed then, and admit me to paradise." 4 years later, he died at age 76 from pneumonia. He was buried in Paris in a service attended by more than 4,000 people. Over 20 years later, his remains were removed to Florence at the request of the Italian government. So what of his legacy? During his lifetime and long afterwards, Rossini was beloved by musicians and audiences. For example, Verdi initiated a collaboration with a dozen other composers to write a requiem mass in his honor. Yet critics and academics often disdained him. George Bernard Shaw called him one of the greatest masters of claptrap that ever lived. Rossini was neither the first nor the last composer that audiences have loved, while critics have told them not to. And these are his 39 operas. After his death, most faded from performance. The Metropolitan Opera mounted very little Rossini apart from the Barber of Seville, and the same was largely true around the world. This started to change in the 1960s and 70s, with singers like Marilyn Horne, Joan Sutherland, and Beverly Sills resurrecting Rossini's operas quite successfully. In 1980, the Rossini Opera Festival was established in his hometown of Pizzaro by the Teatro Rossini, a theater named in his honor during his lifetime. Around the same time, the Ricordi Publishing House began publishing critical editions of his operas. And so the tide has changed, and Rossini's operas are now more commonplace. In November 2024, you can see performances of La Cenerentola, La Comptorie, Moses in Egypt, Il Turco in Italia, William Tell, and of course, the Barber of Seville. Although this is not his epitaph, this is my favorite quote from Rossini. "Every kind of music is good, except the boring kind." Now let's look at the Barber of Seville. First, the story of the opera, which takes place in Seville around 1800. Outside the home of Dr. Bartolo, Count Almaviva sings a dawn serenade to Rosina, Bartolo's ward. Almaviva has disguised himself as a poor student named Lindoro. Here, played by our video dog, is Santiago Ballerini at the Canadian Opera Company. Figaro happens by and tells everyone that he is the greatest barber in Seville, needed by everyone for everything. This is Bjorn Berger at the Glyndebourne Festival.
Tutti mi vogliono, donne ragazzi, e che fanciulle, vuole barocca, presso la barba, quella sanguigna. Presso il getto, tutti mi chiedono, tutti mi vogliono, tutti mi chiedono, tutti mi vogliono, quella parrucca, presso la barba, presso il getto. Ehi, Figaro! Figaro! Figaro, 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 ahimè, ahimè, che furia, ahimè, che balla, balla volta, per carità, per carità, per carità, una volta, per carità.
Almaviva, who Figaro worked for several years earlier, tells him that he wants to meet Rosina, so Figaro devises a plan. The Count will disguise himself as a drunk soldier with orders to be quartered at Bartolo's house. Inside the house, Rosina reflects on the voice that has enchanted her and resolves to meet him. This is Joyce DiDonato at the Metropolitan Opera.
Io sono dolce, sono rispettosa, sono obbediente, dolce amorosa, mi lascio reggere, mi può guidare, mi può guidare. Ma se mi trovano dove io devo, sarò non viverò, sarò. E 100 grammi prima di cedere, oro giocare.
Don Basilio, Rosina's music teacher, warns Dr. Bartolo that Count Almaviva is interested in his ward. Bartolo decides to marry Rosina himself. Figaro, who has overheard all of this, warns Rosina and promises to deliver a note from her to Lindoro. Almaviva arrives disguised as a drunk soldier. As Bartolo argues with him, Almaviva tells Rosina that he is Lindoro and slips her a note. The argument grows louder, and Figaro tells them they are attracting a crowd. The civil guard bursts in to arrest Almaviva, but he secretly reveals his identity to the sergeant and is released, causing mass confusion. This is from the Metropolitan Opera. Act 2. The Count returns, this time disguised as Don Alonso, a student of Basilio. He says that Basilio is ill, so he, Don Alonso, will give Rosina her singing lesson. Bartolo buys this act and allows the music lesson to proceed. As Bartolo dozes off, Almaviva and Rosina declare their love. Figaro arrives to give Bartolo his shave and swipes the key to Rosina's balcony. Then Basilio shows up looking perfectly healthy. A quick bride convinces him that he is in fact ill and must go home. This is John Relier and company at the Metropolitan Opera.
Buonasera, e di cuore. Buonasera, 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 e di cuore. Poco manzi parlerà.
While Figaro is shaving Bartolo, Almaviva and Rosina plot to elope. Bartolo overhears them and everyone flees. Bartolo tells Basilio to fetch a notary so Bartolo can marry Rosina that very night. Bartolo then persuades Rosina that Lindoro is planning to kidnap her for Count Almaviva. Figaro and the Count climb a ladder to Rosina's balcony. Rosina confronts Lindoro, who finally reveals his true identity as Count Almaviva. When they see a light at the front door, they decide to depart back down the ladder. This is Joyce DiDonato, Juan Diego Flores, and Peter Mattei at the Met.
Per la scala del piano piano zitti zitti piano per la scala del balcone presto andiamo via di qua.
Basilio shows up with a notary, but quick thinking by Figaro means the notary marries Rosina and Almaviva instead. Bartolo returns, but it is too late. He accepts that he is lost, and everyone celebrates with a happy ending. So, how did we get here? The Barber of Seville, or The Useless Precaution, was first a comedy by French playwright Pierre-Augustin Caron de Beaumarchais. Beaumarchais had a colorful life and career, starting as a watchmaker, then becoming a music teacher to the French royal family, then an entrepreneur, a playwright, a spy, and ultimately an arms dealer during the American Revolution. But at this point, in the early 1770s, Beaumarchais is in his 40s, a semi-failed businessman, and a moderately successful playwright. He initially conceived of The Barber of Seville in 1772 as an opera, but the Théâtre Italien rejected the idea. So he wrote it as a play a year later, the same year during which he got into a fight with a duke over the duke's lover and was thrown in prison for 4 months, and then separately lost a major lawsuit with the heir of his business partner. So The Barber of Seville was put aside and did not premiere at the Comédie Française until 1775. The plot is the one we know from the opera, and it had music by Antoine Laurent Baudron. Opening night was not a success, so Beaumarchais rapidly rewrote it and turned it into a hit 3 days later. It was swiftly performed in London, then around Europe. Mozart even wrote a set of variations on Almaviva's Serenade. Beaumarchais would go on to write 2 more plays involving Figaro, Count Almaviva, and Rosina, The Marriage of Figaro in 1784 and The Guilty Mother in 1792. So who exactly is Figaro? Pulling information from all 3 plays, it seems the following. He is the illegitimate child of Dr. Bartolo and his maid and was kidnapped as a baby. As a young man, he worked in Count Almaviva's household to support himself while studying surgery. He then got a job in Madrid as an assistant veterinarian. While there, he dabbled in a literary career with success. He was fired from his vet job, but stayed in Madrid to work as a playwright. He ran afoul of the censors and was briefly imprisoned. Eventually, he gave up writing and became a barber. He worked in various parts of Spain before setting up shop in Seville, where he ran into Count Almaviva again, helped him win Rosina, that's the plot of The Barber of Seville, and was then hired as the Count's valet, which is where we find him in the second play, The Marriage of Figaro. Got that? Beaumarchais' Barber of Seville was turned into an enormously successful opera by Giovanni Paisiello in 1782, and it was then turned into operas by 4 other composers. But Paisiello's was the hit show and was still being performed in Italy when Rossini embarked on his version. Meet Gege and Seisei, who live with baritone Li Fandeng, who is singing the role of Fiorello with us. So, it is now December 1815, and the 23-year-old Rossini has just signed a contract with Duke Francesco Sforza Cesarini, the head of Rome's Teatro Argentina. The contract said he would write an opera from any libretto given to him, compose it for the talents of a specified set of singers, make any changes requested, and conduct the first 3 performances. For this, he would be paid 400 scudi, less than any of the singers. As was the norm, the Teatro Argentina had a set company of singers for whom Rossini would write the show, and this was the first cast of Barber. Luigi Zamboni, who sang Figaro, was a well-known bass baritone and a friend of Rossini's father. Rossini even stayed with Zamboni while he was writing Barber. Later in life, Zamboni managed an Italian opera company in St. Petersburg, Russia. Manuel Garcia, who would sing Almaviva, was a celebrated Spanish tenor and composer. He had worked with Rossini before. A few months earlier, he had almost caused opening night of Elisabetta to be delayed until the theater management threatened to have him thrown in jail if he did not show up for rehearsal. Gertrude Righetti Giorgi, a childhood friend of Rossini, would sing Rosina. She was not Cesarini's first choice, as she had been off stage for a while, and he was concerned that whatever merit she may have had in the past, she is now out of practice or of advanced age. But when he couldn't afford his first choice, who happened to be the Figaro's sister-in-law, he hired Righetti. As for her advanced age, she was 23 years old. Garcia, who played opposite her, was 41. Before they started Barber of Seville, this same cast performed Rossini's L'Italiana in Algerie in early January 1816. Cesarini wrote in a letter to a friend, "I am holding a knife to everyone's throat in order to get the opera onto the stage by Wednesday. We shall go on the stage unprepared, with the actors totally exhausted. Last night, I spent from 1 until 5 in the morning at a rehearsal of the first act under the direction of Maestro Rossini. Standing about in a theater in this degree of cold is as bad as being on an alpine pass, with the result that Rossini, the prima donna, the tenor, and everyone else was shivering the entire time." As predicted, opening night of L'Italiana was not a good performance, but eventually the cast settled into their parts. So now it was time for Rossini to write them the new opera, which did not yet have a libretto. The morning after L'Italiana opened, Cesarini signed a contract with Cesare Sterbini to write a libretto based on Beaumarchais' The Barber of Seville. We don't know much about Sterbini. He was a minor official in the Vatican Treasury and had written an opera with Rossini a couple months earlier. And he wasn't the first librettist hired. Cesarini had originally hired someone who suggested a plot about an innkeeper's wife, which was rejected. So Cesarini engaged Sterbini, who later said he had accepted the gig against his will. Things proceeded at Rossini's usual breakneck pace. Sterbini wrote fast, Rossini composed fast, and the singers rehearsed fast. As usual, Rossini did a bit of recycling. Part of Rosina's Una voce poco fa came from Elisabetta, which had premiered 3 months earlier. Meanwhile, Giovanni Paisiello was still alive, and his Barber of Seville was still popular, so Rossini needed to be careful not to offend. Thus, his opera was not called The Barber of Seville. It was called Almaviva. In the printed libretto, Rossini proclaimed his respect and veneration for the immortal composer who preceded him. He also avoided musicalizing sections of the play that Paisiello was famous for, such as a sneezing trio. Meet Rose, who occasionally comes to work at the Madison Opera Center with her human, director of production Jill Krinicki. Her pet bunny does not have a name yet. 4 days before opening night of The Barber of Seville, the 44-year-old impresario Cesarini had a heart attack and died. But the show got on, opening on February 20th, 1816. Rossini conducted, wearing a Spanish-style coat that was both valuable and ridiculous-looking, causing the audience to laugh when he entered the orchestra pit. It was a legendarily bad performance, with the audience hissing and jeering. Some of this came from supporters of Paisiello, unhappy about this new Barber of Seville. Some of it came from supporters of a rival theater, who thought Rossini's opera should have premiered at their place. But matters on stage did not help. Manuel Garcia was an accomplished guitarist, so he accompanied himself on Count Almaviva's Act I serenade. But on opening night, he forgot to tune his guitar, so it sounded terrible, and then one of the strings broke, causing audience laughter. When Rosina entered immediately following, her first few lyrics were "Keep singing, darling," more audience laughter. When Don Basilio entered, he tripped on a trapdoor and broke his nose, wiping the blood off on his costume. More laughter. Then, as the Act I finale was beginning, a cat wandered onto the stage. While continuing to sing, each cast member tried to get the cat to leave, which it of course refused to do. Eventually, someone got it off stage, and some wondered how the cat got there in the first place. But by that point, it was too late to redeem the show. The audience was ruthless throughout the second act, adding meows to their boos. One critic said afterwards, "All the whistlers in Italy seem to have given themselves a rendezvous for this performance." Rossini rose from the harpsichord to applaud his singers at the end of each act in explicit defiance of the audience. He was loudly booed and laughed at that evening, and later said, "I had to protect myself from an audience that was completely out of control. I really thought they were going to assassinate me." I will add something else to the why opening night was a disaster theory. If Rossini wrote the opera in about 2 weeks, that means the cast likely had only a few days to learn the music, memorize it, and rehearse it. I'm guessing it was not a particularly solid performance. Rossini, who was still only 23 years old, wrote to his mother the day after opening, "Last night my opera went on stage and was solemnly booed. In spite of it all, the music is very beautiful, and people are beginning to talk more optimistically about the second performance this evening, when they will actually hear the music, something that never happened last night." Rossini refused to attend the second night, even though his contract required him to conduct it. After the performance, which was indeed a success, someone from the Teatro Argentina went to Rossini's apartment and told him to get dressed and go to the theater to greet a now adoring public. Rossini's response: "Expletive the public, their bravos, and all the rest." But he wrote to his mother later that week, "Audiences have done nothing but applaud my work with an indescribable fanaticism, obliging me to appear 5 or 6 times on stage, to receive applause of a kind that is entirely new to me and which has made me cry with pleasure. My Barber of Seville is a masterpiece." And speaking of the second performance, remember what I said earlier about Rossini writing his overtures the morning of opening night. For Barber, he did not even do that. We don't know what was played on opening night, possibly nothing. But for the second performance, the orchestra played the overture to Rossini's Orleano in Palmira, which had then become the overture to Elisabetta, Queen of England, and is now known as the overture to the Barber of Seville. Meet Sprout and Fig, who live with bass Alex Taylor, who is singing the role of Don Basilio with us. So Almaviva was now a hit, and it was renamed the Barber of Seville a few months later after Giovanni Paisiello died, and legends about its writing began. The biggest legend was how long it took Rossini to write the thing. Estimates ranged from 9 days to 3 weeks. Donizetti was once asked if he believed that Rossini wrote Barber in 13 days and replied, "Why not? He always was lazy." Donizetti wrote 70 operas, so Rossini did indeed look lazy with only 39 by comparison. It's also said that Rossini did not get shaved while writing the show. A friend commented on the irony of writing The Barber without visiting a barber, and Rossini responded, "If I had shaved, I would have had to go out. And if I had gone out, I would not have finished Barbiere in 13 days. Within a few years of its premiere, Barber was being performed around the world. It went to London in 1818, the first of Rossini's operas to be performed there. Reviews were mixed. One said, "A more perfect performance in all of its parts we have never witnessed. Rossini is a perfect master of nature and of his art." But another wrote, "With 3 or 4 exceptions, the music is considerably more flat and commonplace than anything we have heard lately." The work was greeted coolly in Paris until the impresario of the Teatro Italien cleverly put on Paisiello's version of Barber, and Rossini's was judged the better opera. Barber came to New York in 1819, performed in English. The Evening Post wrote in advance, "Reports speak in loud terms of the new opera called The Barber of Seville, which is expected to be most effective." That performance wasn't exactly as Rossini wrote it, however. The tenor interpolated 3 different songs, all by different composers. Although, to be clear, this was not an uncommon practice for opera in general at this time. Barber was then performed in French in New Orleans in 1823, and then in New York again in 1825, now in Italian. This New York performance was a big deal on a historical level, so let's look at it. Manuel Garcia, the original Count Almaviva, was hired to bring an Italian opera company to New York by a coalition consisting of a theater manager, a winemaker, and Lorenzo da Ponte, who had written the libretti for Mozart's Marriage of Figaro, Don Giovanni, and Così fan tutte, and was now teaching Italian at Columbia University. Italian opera was a new concept for the US. Barber of Seville was less than a decade old. The New York Evening Post told its readers that opera was the most elegant and refined among the amusements of the higher classes of the old world. The Park Theater was packed on opening night on November 29th. Box seats cost double the usual, up to $2. In the audience were the wealthy and not wealthy, American industrialists and European immigrants. James Fenimore Cooper was there. So was Napoleon's brother, Joseph Bonaparte, ex-king of Spain, now a resident of New Jersey. The cast consisted largely of Garcia's family. His wife played the maid Berta, while his son Manuel Jr. sang Figaro. Garcia himself sang Almaviva. Opposite him as Rosina was his 17-year-old daughter. This daughter, Maria Malibran, would become a celebrated mezzo-soprano before dying at age 28. These performances were what launched her career. Critics called her a divine revelation of what music might be. The Garcia family would go on that season to introduce a number of operas to the US, including the first American performance of Don Giovanni. Meet Ham, Swiss, and Rye, who live with principal coach and accompanist Scott Gendel. As for Rossini, he was still busy writing opera. Barber was his 17th opera. He wrote 22 more after its premiere. But Barber was always his most famous, both during his lifetime and in years to come. Giuseppe Verdi called it the finest opera buffa in existence. Beethoven wrote to Rossini, "I congratulate you. It will be played as long as Italian opera exists." And it has been. Barber has never left the repertoire, but there have been changes to it over the centuries. In the original production, Almaviva had a long aria just before the finale. It promptly got cut for the next 150 years. Rossini recycled the tune a year later as Cinderella's final aria in La Cenerentola. The role of Rosina was written for a mezzo, but sopranos swiftly claimed the role, changing keys and ornamenting higher. Rosina's Act II music lesson became a place of improvisation. Rossini himself wrote a new aria for this scene back in 1818. And for much of the 19th and 20th centuries, sopranos sang whatever they wanted there, whether it was a parlor song, the Queen of the Night's Vengeance aria, or the mad scene from Lucia di Lammermoor. Some ads, like this one for Adelina Patti, even advertised what she would be singing during the lesson scene. And this practice did not end until the mid-1950s. Even though Barber has always been beloved by audiences, the same could not be said of critics. When the Metropolitan Opera included Barber in its opening season in 1883, the New York Times gave a glowing review to the Rosina, but added, "Without a great Rosina, the Barber nowadays would be simply unbearable. Its everlasting recitatives and monotonous finales and its archaic Italian comedy belong decidedly to a past age. Il Barbiere di Siviglia has been done to death. Rossini's Figaro scarcely interests a modern audience." Evidently, Rossini's Figaro did interest a modern audience because the Met kept performing it for the next century, with rarely more than a year or two between productions. And as the 20th century went on, Barber was a fixed part of the opera repertoire around the world. It was made into an Italian film in 1947, and it was one of the first operas aired on television, with an English language production on NBC in 1952 and a German language production on German television in 1959. This season, there are productions everywhere from Australia to Denmark, Japan, and of course, the US, as you can see on this list. A coda. In 1968, the final year of his life, Rossini received a letter from a now forgotten young Italian composer who was setting Beaumarchais' Barber of Seville to music. Rossini wrote to him, "This word audacity is the only one that I find superfluous in your charming letter. I certainly didn't regard myself as audacious when after Paisiello I set Beaumarchais' delightful subject to music. So why should you be, if after half a century you bring a new style to the musical setting of the Barber? So may your new Barber join your earlier works in assuring imperishable glory for its author and for our common homeland. Such are the cordial wishes offered to you by the old man of Pizarro, whose name is Rossini. This will be Madison Opera's 4th production of Barber in our 64-year history, and this is our cast. Figaro is sung by Benjamin Taylor, who debuted with us as Silvio in Pagliacci in 2018, and has since sung at the Metropolitan Opera, Bavarian State Opera, and more. Rosina is sung by Keely Futterer, who debuted with us last season in The Anonymous Lover. She has sung at Wolf Trap Opera and Minnesota Opera, among others. Count Almaviva is sung by David Walton. He sang Belmonte in The Abduction from the Seraglio here, and has sung with the Glimmerglass Festival and Minnesota Opera, among others. And he will accompany his serenade on his guitar, just like Manuel Garcia did in the premiere. Dr. Bartolo is sung by Levi Hernandez, who debuted with us as Papageno, then returned for Florencia and Al Amazonas. Don Basilio is sung by Alex Taylor, a Madison resident who debuted with us as the mother in the 7 Deadly Sins. 3 of our studio artists make up the balance of the cast, and they are joined by the gentlemen of the Madison Opera Chorus. The production is directed by Rebecca Herman in her debut with us and conducted by John DeMaine. Our set and costumes are traditional and come from New Orleans Opera and Sarasota Opera, respectively. So back to an earlier question of why Rossini was so popular and why his music and Barber of Seville in particular have lasted over 2 centuries. Perhaps this quote from Rossini explains it. The language of music is common to all generations and nations. It is understood by everybody, since it is understood with the heart. And one last pet photo before we go to questions. Meet Saxon and Luna, who live with stage director Rebecca Herman. So now let's go to questions. If you're watching this on October 10th, please type your questions into the YouTube conversation box so I can see them. If you are watching this afterwards, feel free to send an email to info@madisonopera.org. Okay. Let's see. You referenced gambling a few times, like a gambling hall connected to La Scala or gambling happening in opera house lobbies. Was this common? Why? I'm surprised by this. Yes, it was, at least in Italy. Places of entertainment, truthfully. I think opera houses were a place of entertainment. People also ate during performances, so why not gambling? Yeah, it's how they made money. I mean, for that matter, they served food during the performance. One thing I didn't talk about, Barber of Seville has literally what's called an aria di sorbetto or sorbet aria for Berta, where they would literally serve ice cream during the show. Let's see, another. Perhaps tricky, impossible to answer, but why Seville? It doesn't seem like Seville played a role in Rossini's biography. Was there a reason for setting the story there? Well, he was based in it on Beaumarchais' play. And why Beaumarchais set it in Seville, not really sure. I mean, it's a slightly exotic setting compared to France or Italy, lets you do things with costuming. I think it was just, from a theatrical standpoint, a cool place to set it. There's nothing that says it should be in Seville. Okay, any more questions? No more questions? So I will draw out this preview to a close. Thank you for watching. I hope this made you smile for a bit. I hope you consider coming to see Barber of Seville in a few weeks, and have a wonderful night. Thank you.